Greetings, people. Captain Blade J52 here with another video coming at you guys from the Space Engineers franchise this go around. And for today's video, we're going to be looking at a feature request that has recently been marked as under consideration for inclusion into Space Engineers 2 on the Keensoft Warehouse website. Now, whenever something like this happens on the Keen website, that doesn't automatically mean that it's going to for sure be included in the game. It might be, it might not be. It just depends on the proposed thing. Now, whenever they mark something as under consideration, they mean just that, basically. It's essentially them acknowledging the feedback that people are interested in it, and they're going to consider it. They might add it, they might not. It just depends on the feature request. For this video, we're going to be looking at the proposed heat management system or at least the current version at the time of recording this that has been marked as under consideration. We're going to look at should it be added, should it not be added, as well as giving some pros and cons, as well as a bit of a video response to a Diggrok video that was posted on the subject. Now we're going to break down his very thoughtful video and give some responses from the opposite side of the aisle, as well as giving some of my thoughts as a modder and someone with dev experience creating content for other games. Now really quickly, some of my background is that I came to the Space Engineers franchise in late 2015, early 2016 time when I first bought the game. However, I didn't actively start playing on the regular until 2016. I made my first Space Engineers mod in 2017, which was my Galdax thrusters, which was to address some of my complaints around hydrogen thrusters at the time, which later spawned several other mods related to armor, gyros, and even a full-on rebalance. Now, I've been creating content for other games and stuff for a little over 20 years now. I'm not a Keen dev, as cool as that would be, however. Now, some of my more successful creations and projects were maps and levels for games like Time Splitter's Future Perfect, which were sometimes EA recommended downloads for several weeks at the time back in the era and back in the day. Now, some of my other stuff has been levels and mods for games like Star Trek Armada 2, among others, and now, of course, Space Engineers. Now, I'm far from the most prolific modder in Space Engineers. However, I do have a few hundred hours into modding the game at this point, and I like to think I know a thing or two. Now, there's always more to learn, of course, but I like to think I know my way around decently enough. Now, some of my initial thoughts on this are as follows. While I'm not sold on the feature personally, I have to give credit where it's due and acknowledge that Diggrok's video is one of the most thoughtful on the subject that I've seen, where he's attempting to bridge the gap between people who want to see heat and people who don't. I strongly disagree with some of the conclusions that he and some of the other heat advocates reach, but I can at least respect why he holds the views that he does. And in my personal opinion, videos like his are how it should be done. He's making a good faith effort to get the system in place, and even respecting that not everybody's going to like it, which is why he suggests that it can be turned on or off, like the pressurization feature or some other high-impact features as well. Now, in addition to this, I have to give one criticism, and that is that the video, even as well thought out as it is and for what's being presented, did not take enough time to explain some of the benefits that people would get. There's not enough focus on why a person would or should want to do a world with the heat system enabled. And I'm going to explain a little bit more on that as we go. Now, really quickly, why I'm opposed to the heat system as it sits currently is in part because of the fact that every time I've seen a heat system almost, it has been purely adding something to manage just to have something to manage. Meaning it's basically just busy work with no positive or negative benefits, or worse yet is it's all negatives and no benefits whatsoever. Meaning that there's no draw factor there. There's nothing to get you hooked and keep you wanting to come back for more, like a good book series or a good series of movies, or something similar to that. Pardon me. And I don't find that kind of stuff fun. Now, in addition to this, I find more often than not, heat systems focus too much on adding challenge for the sake of challenge, and sometimes get off into wanting to limit gun bricks, quote unquote, internal thrusters, welders, or similar stuff that the user finds problematic and comes off as wanting to punish people for essentially wrong build or wrong think or however you want to say it. And it worries too much about realism for realism's sake that it neglects to focus on the positives that a system could bring. Like a car salesman trying to convince me to buy a car, but he's focusing exclusively on the negatives. Like, you're not going to get a sale that way, my dude. Now, I'm also of the mindset that if people have done the proper engineering to make those gun bricks or similar stuff work without exploits, they shouldn't be punished for making that build work just because some people don't like it. Doesn't matter if they're cheesy, doesn't matter if they're whatever. There's better ways to approach that kind of stuff. Now, oftentimes as well, when I read over the stated goals of a heat system, I often find that it can be accomplished much, much easier with more appropriate server settings without the need to implement an entirely new mechanic and can be made to work with stuff we have now. I also value the build freedom that we've had in Space Engineers 1 for well over a decade now. And if I'm going to be asked to give up some of that build freedom for a feature request, I want to see an equal or greater value in return for what I'm being asked to give up. And the heat systems often demand way too much sacrifice for way too little in return. Kind of like demanding $500 worth of investment for only $200 worth of potential fun or benefit. And whenever a feature falls into the category of just nothing but harm to build freedom, or there's too many negatives for too little return, I'm going to oppose that feature 99% of the time, with very few, if any, exceptions. In addition to this, there's too many times that heat systems fall into the too many negatives or exclusively negatives category with no benefits. And we're going to address this a little bit more later. But getting into some of the goals and considerations that Diggrok states for a heat system is he wants it to be a low learning curve and he wants it to be new player friendly, perhaps having some advanced fine-tuning elements, and perhaps finding ways to use it as a combat balance to increase survivability. So some of my first thoughts on this are, I agree, it should be a low learning curve and new player friendly, because if you hit them with something way too advanced straight out of the gate, that's going to be a major turnoff to a lot of people. As far as the fine-tuning stuff goes, I don't know that that's going to be needed depending on the implementation of the mechanic, because too many options and you can get lost in the sauce dealing with stuff that just does not matter. But more on that in a little bit. Now, whenever I see combat balance arguments for stuff like this, like I was mentioning earlier, this sends up some red flags to me, because too often it comes off as wanting to punish wrong think or wrong build, such as, turret spam, as some might call it. And combat balance is also far too often a very open-ended term that means different things to different people. What I consider to be balanced, another person may not, and vice versa. Thankfully, Diggrok is going to elaborate a little bit more, and although I disagree with a lot of it, I can respect why he thinks the way that he does. But getting to the first parts of the form that this feature would take. We have essentially 4 parts here, or 3 parts, depending on how you want to consider the heat stat moving passively. You can see some of it here in the little graphic I've borrowed from his video. You can see it's essentially a gauge to measure the heat, a couple of blocks to get rid of the heat and handle it, a safety shutoff to avoid overheating damage, and then he would have the heat move passively through the grid like power. That way there's no big convoluted conveyor systems and having to come up with, well, what if it doesn't have conveyor access kind of stuff. So I agree with him that it needs to be kept simple for performance reasons. There's no need to reinvent the wheel every single time that we're potentially adding something new or something is proposed. You've got the gauge to measure it, a few initial blocks to deal with it, maybe a third emergency oh crap option later, the safety shut off, and then having it move passively through the grid is about the simplest form I can think of. And if I were to create a system like this is pretty much what I would do, so I give him props to this. It's short, sweet, and to the point. I'll also agree with something he said in the video as well about having a slider similar to perhaps the hunger function, where you can dial it up or down if you want to customize it a little bit more for your server. Maybe you want something a little more challenging. Maybe you just want to kind of take it easy and still interact with it some, but not have it like in your face all the time. So there's that. Or if you just don't want to deal with it at all, turn it off, like you could with pressurization or shields, assuming that shields actually get added to the game. And Diggrok is going to explain a little bit more on that later. Getting into some of his justifications now, I've summarized some of these the best that I understood them, that kind of stuff. If there's something that I've missed, he's more than welcome to, make a response to this and say, hey, this is what I was actually trying to say to this, and, us have a healthy debate. But some of the things that he cites is that it's an important part of spacecraft design today, because getting rid of heat can be very slow in space, and it's such a major issue that most of the modern space games include some type of heat management mechanic, with a lot of players being accustomed to it, according to him. He also cites some cosmetic reasons and cosmetic blocks of stuff looking cooler. He also believes it would be more fun and can give people something new to do. He also gets a little bit more into some of the balancing combat kind of thing, which I'm glad to see him starting to define some of this. Now, he says one of the chief balancing arguments is stopping gun bricks that have a million reactors and shields, assuming shields get added, as stated by a member of his Discord. So he kind of draws from a Discord member for part of that. And I don't remember exactly what the name of the guy was that he said, but that's not really important. But he also mentions how bigger ships should have to focus on the heat mechanic more. He talks about introducing a new vulnerability that people could target, which would be the cooling subsystem, and how he hopes it would create realistic combat to increase the survival rates. And also how you could potentially work with heat signature detection and make some heat-seeking sensors, essentially, that can make ships either harder or easier to detect. So the first thing I would say to this, as far as to why heat should or shouldn't be added, is that while yes, heat dissipation is a major concern in real-life spacecraft design, just because something is realistic doesn't automatically make it fun or mean that it should be included in the game. There's times when realism needs to take a back seat to fun for the sake of the game. Otherwise, if the game's not fun, why are you playing it? Now, I hate ammo racking in every single game that has it. It's an unfun and unskilled way to win or lose a fight. And because of that, I disable it every chance that I get. Now, some people may like it, and hey, if you're one of those people, more power to you. It's just, this is my personal thoughts on that. In addition to this, simply because other games have a mechanic like heat dissipation and such, does not mean that Space Engineers needs it also. What works well for one game doesn't always translate well for another. Now, I'll agree with him for sure that there could be some really cool stuff to come from this. I'll say this, as far as some of the radiator blocks and some of the stuff he's got in some of his graphics that I borrowed from the video, I like the cosmetic look of what some of those blocks could look like. So yeah, there is definitely some fun cosmetic stuff that could be done. Where I start to disagree with him some more is I wouldn't necessarily call managing heat a fun thing. It would certainly be new to the Space Engineers franchise, sure. I'll grant that all day long because factually it is. It would be something new. But new doesn't always mean good or better. Getting into the balancing part that he mentions here. Again, this is where I start to see some red flag territory as mentioned before. Because if you have too many drawbacks, that kind of stuff, or too much focus on adding challenge and so on without talk of positives, and people start mentioning things like wanting to limit gun bricks or similar, it comes off as wanting to punish people again for wrong build or wrong think, and for building incorrectly, even if that's not necessarily how the user means for it to sound. And I'm not accusing Diggrok by any stretch of the imagination of trying to be malicious or anything like that. I do believe he is sincerely well intentioned. I really do. And I do believe he's trying to make a good faith effort. I'm simply speaking in this instance based on a general sense from past experience with these types of suggestions. But, like I said, too much focus on stopping people from building a certain way and not enough focus on benefits they're going to get in return. It's just not, it's not a good thing, like people try to say that it is. Now, introducing a new vulnerability could certainly be a way for people to fight back against a potentially superior force even, and force them to disengage if they lose too much cooling. However, there is a bit of a downside to this and a caveat. If combat is too reliant on cooling, it's no longer about the engineering and the skill of the pilot, and it becomes about who can keep the most cooling on their ship. So if you're somebody that doesn't like the idea of gun bricks, you're trading gun bricks for radiator bricks, and then you're right back to where you were before, and nothing has changed, except the form of the brick that you don't like. And we can debate what the final effectiveness of cooling versus heat generation should be. I expect that would happen with something like this anyway, but that's just something to keep in mind. Heat signature detection. That's one that can be a positive thing or negative. It depends heavily on who's using it and what for. Because, yeah, it can be a good thing. It can be a warning system. Or it can be a negative thing that allows folks to hunt down new players for the purposes of griefing and, being a jerk. On its own, heat signature detection isn't enough to make me want the heat feature, but it does at least get my attention at the potential thought of new detection mechanics being added, and something is being considered in that area. Now, if detecting grids is a concern, at least to me anyway, there's other ways that can be used aside from heat detection. The same effect can be accomplished by just having better sensors with greater range in general. Mechanically, yes, heat can work for this, but it's not necessary in order to make it work. Looking at the cooling blocks again, you can see here some of what each one would do, such as the radiators being placed externally, glowing when they're hot, getting rid of so much heat per second. The more exposed they are means the more efficient they are at getting rid of heat. Your heat sinks being kind of your first line of defense against a heat spike and somewhat of an oh crap kind of thing almost, maybe. Now, some of my thoughts on this when it comes to radiators. So, placing them externally, yeah, that makes sense. And getting rid of so much heat per second sounds like your standard run-of-the-mill generates X per second type of block. And I would assume and hope that those values of generates or gets rid of X heat per second are moddable. And that way people could add more or less advanced radiators than what would currently exist, if that's what they want to do. For the more exposed equals more efficient thing, I have a bit of an issue with this here. And that's if the radiators are flat surfaces with one visible face by which they can expel heat, then the restriction is pointless from a gameplay perspective, and it just punishes people for trying to protect the radiator by placing some armor around it. And the only way this restriction would make sense is if the radiators were double-sided and could expel heat from two different sides, similar to a solar panel, as mentioned previously, by Diggrok in the video. And he does mention them being flat like solar panels, and if he clarified that they would be double-sided, then I missed that part, so maybe he'll clarify that, should he see this, that kind of thing. But that's something I wish there was a little bit more clarification as to which variant we're talking about. For heat sinks, them not shedding heat and getting rid of it as fast as radiators makes sense, because they're meant to hold a little bit more heat. That's the trade-off, is they don't get rid of it as quick. However, I would have loved to have seen a ballpark of the difference between a radiator and a heat sink get discussed, just for sake of discussion, what would it be like? Throw a number out to quantify. Doesn't have to be exact, but I would have liked to have seen something. Is it, say, 40% the heat dissipation rate of a radiator in exchange for being able to hold the extra heat? What are we talking about? And I still agree with him that having heat move passively through the grid versus having to be piped is a very, very great thing. Otherwise, it's going to be a performance nightmare. As far as tracking the heat goes, he proposes some basic stuff. You can see some of it on the screen here. I borrowed some of his graphics. Yet again, each module would have, or each block, have an ideal temperature they operate at and that they can handle on the normal. If they get pushed past that range, then they start to generate heat units. Heat units get moved to the heat sinks to get dealt with, and then once the heat sinks are full, they can't hold any more heat and stuff can start to overheat because it can't transfer to the cooling system. There's also the potential, according to him, that certain subsystems could generate heat faster than can be pulled away, even if the radiators aren't necessarily full. This could be due to design issues, could be due to damage, due to heavy use with combat. There's basically different ways that it can happen. And there would be some icons along with some alerts to say, hey, this is what's overheating, this is what's going on, and let people keep track of it a lot easier, which is something that would definitely be needed. So, seems pretty straightforward so far. No issues with this part as it's been proposed. He's designating a way for heat to be generated, how it's going to move, and how it's going to be tracked on the UI. For the overheated modules and heat damage section, you can see kind of what he's going for here. If a module overheats, it can tolerate, say, roughly 10 seconds of its own heat as output before it starts to experience negative effects. As it starts to push more and more into the overheated territory, it's going to lose efficiency as a percentage based on how much it's overheated. Now, after the tolerance period, we start to see damage going to the block. Now, I'll give him some credit here, and I'm really glad that he mentioned how much the tolerance period could look like and gave us something to quantify, because now it's like, okay, if this is what he's intending, I might want to adjust that up, I might want to adjust that down, or maybe it's just fine where it is. And it gives people an idea of what they could potentially expect. The final number doesn't have to stay at the 10 seconds, but you've at least gave us something to quantify and kind of picture it in our heads to get an idea. Then he talks about how heat damage would work when stuff happens. So, a couple of things that I see here is, I'm assuming that when he talks about efficiency loss, that a block that is 50% overheated would suffer a 50% penalty to its effectiveness, since he mentioned it being percentage based. Now, I will say this, heat damage only reducing a block to the non-functional red line versus jumping straight to destroying the block is a very respectable thing. It gives people a chance to fix it, and I'm going to assume that people would rather a block be rendered non-functional and stay alive and them have to replace a few things versus it just going straight up boom if it gets too hot. Now, I do wish, however, he had quantified a ballpark for what he meant by gradual damage to the components. Let's assume a reactor is overheating as just an example, and it's the reactor components that are going to eat some damage. Are we talking this damage tick is being applied every few seconds? Is it going to be applied every second? How often would the damage tick and, do stuff and do its thing? And when we're talking about components being lost, let's assume it's the reactor components again. Are we talking 10% of the reactor components every single damage tick? Are we talking 20% or higher? What's a ballpark number so we can kind of figure out, okay, this is maybe a rough idea of what I can expect. Even if it's not the final number, because that can always be adjusted by modders and so forth. But it would have been nice to have something to quantify, to kind of picture in, our brains. Something that I believe the Heat advocates aren't really considering as much as they need to is that if the heat damage is too high to certain blocks that overheat, you're running the risk of it being counterproductive to making fights longer and, so on. And you're making it to where instead of it lasting longer like you want, getting into maybe the couple minutes territory, it actually ends even faster than it does now. Now, damage would need to be handled in a way that it doesn't just spam the system constantly calling for damage events. While background calculations, as proposed by Diggrok, is how I would personally do it, too many background calculations can bog a system just as bad as, or even worse, as trying to simulate super complex stuff all the time can. Now, if I were personally designing the overheat damage, I would have it apply the overheat damage once per second and no more often than that. This is going to give maximum time to the player to do something about the heat, and it prevents it from just bogging down the system on its own by trying to apply too many damage events per second. Now, one of the greatest sources of lag in Space Engineers today is the game trying to apply multiple damage events per second and then calculate things like armor deformation, new shapes generated from block loss, and so forth. As asinine as it may seem to some people, yes, sometimes losing blocks can generate more calculated and complex shapes than the completed product can. Now, I also wouldn't do more than 10% of a component type being lost per damage tick if that's applicable, and damage calculations that would result in a fraction of a component being destroyed would have to destroy the whole thing for it to make sense. Now, I would also say that smaller variants of blocks should handle overheating better than the bigger ones, which may seem kind of like a duh moment to some people. However, in not giving them slightly more resistance to the overheat damage, you're going to run into a potential issue that Diggrok says he wants to avoid, where smaller blocks could potentially be invalidated by the bigger ones. I see the previous example of fractional component loss as one example. The damage for smaller stuff, or small grid, I know that's the unified grid, but I keep saying small grid, it could be every 2 seconds versus, every single second to try to avoid some of the fractional calculations. Now, some of the other stuff that he mentions is, again, the heat safety shutoff is, a nice tool that people could use. If it gets shut down from auto shutoff, once it cools down, it could turn itself back on, and could also be paired with event controllers for a little bit better control, so that's a nice thing. He mentions as to how it could potentially alert people in addition to icons. You could have some verbal warnings, which I think is a good thing. And then how also you could have certain environments being a little bit better for getting rid of heat than others, such as, being in water versus in space and so forth. Now, I'll say this much, is the safety shutoff is a must for people, to have the system at least. They could leave it on, such as the newer players, or they could override it for those do or die moments when they would rather, lose a couple of blocks due to overheat damage versus, losing the fight outright. So, no issues with that part of it. I also don't see too many issues with the environment affecting heat dissipation within reason. The one caution I would give, however, is heat shouldn't be so extreme, or heat dissipation rates shouldn't be so extreme in certain areas, such as, say, deserts, that it completely screws over the ability to even build in those places to start with. Grids and activities, would obviously be more prone to heat generation in those areas, sure, and the scales would be tipped toward that side, but you don't want it to be so much so that it makes grids and stuff in those areas useless. We can debate final numbers yet again, but that is something to keep in mind. I'm going to look at this one really quickly, because he attempts to, at some point, tie the heat mechanic into shields and how he would do it. I'm going to do a follow-up video at some point where I address combat and especially shields more directly and how I would do it and balance them out, because I believe that, again, with all due respect to Diggrok and some of the people, that when it comes to shields, they overthink it severely and they make it more complicated than it needs to be based off the experience with stuff like Scythons or defense shields and such. So I don't really fault them for, if that's all they know is those examples, if they're not familiar with some of the other games that use shields and how stuff could work. So anyway, some of what he mentions is to kind of, at least in his mind, balance the shields out, is he would add heat to the shields, and they would contribute to heat through their high energy usage and potentially choke radiator efficiency by trapping heat. And he says that would be a trade-off for a defensive boon. So, a couple of things I would have an issue with here is I get why he's suggesting this, is he wants to try to balance it. However, again, while he's well-intentioned, I like to believe, when I see this as choking radiator efficiency, that's another red flag, because it's an undefined thing. What do we mean by choking efficiency? It can go one of two ways. It can be choked as in it's creating a larger draw on the cooling system, beyond the normal range, but it's still manageable, meaning you can make good use of the shields, but you're just going to need to guarantee you have the extra cooling to keep them from going boom. Or on the opposite end of the coin, choked can also mean that they trap heat and they don't allow any heat to be dissipated at all while they're active, which would essentially neuter the feature and make shields outright useless. In which case, it's just demanding that they trap heat as a spite move so people can beat the shields without having to fight or engineer a way through them. Now, I believe that Diggrok is well-intentioned. A lot of people I see that advocate for heat, I would hope they're suggesting the first one, but a lot of people I've seen also fall into the hardline anti-shield category, and some of them have practically demanded the second one out of pure spite. In which case it becomes like those corrupt a wish threads where, certain groups on social media, they make a wish and somebody's got to come up with a side effect for it and so forth. Now, there's other trade-offs and limitations that can be built into shields themselves without the need for something like this that I'm going to cover in greater detail in the follow-up video, such as better scaling and limits to the shields itself, such as, prime example, having 2 shield generators doesn't double stack the shields, only 1 generator counts. That's a very big one. But again, I'll talk more on this once we get to that second video, but that's just something that I wanted to mention because Diggrok talked about it here very briefly. Getting into some of his combat influences and things of how he sees it potentially going is, you can see some of it here, combat being where heat would be most noticed. It could potentially increase with the combat and, certain stuff exploding from overheat, maybe like gas tanks or something. He also talks about modules being fully hidden behind armor, building more heat, more rapidly than those with some exposure. And the more armor a grid has, the more heat it's going to generate. So, some of this is perfectly fine to me, but I have a few issues with some of this. So a ship using more systems would logically generate more heat. That makes sense. Now, while the heat buildup could cause certain things to explode, that also to me gets very, very close to ammo racking territory, and again is an extremely unfun way to win or lose a fight in my book, and it takes no skill to pull off at all. It's one of the reasons I disabled my, ammo racking for my custom ammo types when I did the rebalance. The ammo can still detonate, quote unquote, but the damage from it is 0. Similar to how you can take a little bit of C4 and you can light that stuff on fire and even cook with it or similar, and it's not going to detonate from you lighting it on fire because it's that stable. It's not going to go off unless you shove a detonator in it and you push the detonator button. Now, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when somebody actually had enough of the gonads to actually try to do that, and how they found out about that, which is kind of funny, but that's another thing for another day. Now, certain things being enclosed on all sides and armor generating more heat makes sense to a limited degree. But the phrasing used in this section of Diggrok's video makes it sound to be more extreme than perhaps he may have intended. I don't know if that's the case or not. This is another reason why I wish he had spent some more time giving some ballpark references along with focusing on more of the positive aspects of things. What are we talking about? Are we talking about, again, like, say a 10% difference? Are we talking higher, lower? What are we looking at here? Because without further context, saying something like that can come across as expecting everyone to leave their critical bits partially exposed for people to pick off and punishing them for not doing it. Now, having the heat system apply too many conditions, such as fully encased versus not fully encased, whether you're in atmo versus space, and similar type stuff to adjust the heat generation ratios, can add too many checks to the system and bog it down just as bad as trying to simulate the full physical heat in real time. So then you're right back to bogging the system down, which we've said we wanted to avoid to start with. Also, if people are going to be potentially punished for not leaving certain bits exposed, or they're going to be potentially penalized for using extra armor to survive a fight longer, what's the point of trying to extend the duration of a fight anyway? Because to me as a content creator, that's where it comes off as giving lip service to wanting longer fights, but in practice you don't actually want them to be longer. Like, you're telling somebody you want them to do a job, but then you actively try to block their access to the tools they need to do it. Now that's, again, not a swipe at Diggrok, but just an issue I have with suggestions like this as a whole when stuff is way too ambiguous. More to address on the combat influence in just a bit. So, some of the optional blocks that he mentions, and some of the ways that could be used, it's like an oh crap kind of thing in other areas. We've got water flushing, which is, steam for emergency cooling, different efficiency modules, like one for keeping heat down. You could use air vents to get rid of heat in an atmo, perhaps even replacing, radiators and heat sinks in atmo outright. And essentially, it's having some additional means of cooling, perhaps some kind of oh crap kind of moments. Now, some of what I would mention here is that water flushing could be used on ground or in space. It's just a matter of where you're ejecting the superheated medium to. The only difference in this instance is the form of medium you're ejecting. You're ejecting the superheated water and the steam versus the radiator. And in this instance, I would also say that the air vents can be used to expel the hot air from inside of a ship, even in space, and it doesn't need to be limited purely to atmo. While the air vent couldn't pull in new air to replace what it's ejecting, and it would be similar to an explosive decompression, you're still getting rid of that superheated air. Now, new breathable air would need to be processed from water and ice to replace what's been vented into space, but if it's a do or die situation, I don't think people are going to care, and they'll happily sacrifice a little bit of water or a little bit of ice in order to stay alive. Some other optional blocks that could be potential benefits, depending on how they go, that heat gives, is turbines and heat recyclers. Mentioning, turbines could use heat to make energy. The heat recyclers could convert heat to energy at a low efficiency for balance reasons, and that the heat recyclers might not even consume heat at all because he wants to avoid an exploit of replacing cooling systems. So, a few things on this. Turbines already exist in real life, and using a heat feature to introduce them, yeah, sure, I can see that. Don't have any issues with, having a heat variant of a turbine. One thing I will say, though, for the heat recyclers, that I don't know how much experience that Diggrok has with creating mods and some of the behind-the-scenes stuff with the game, so I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here that he missed something out of just legitimately not knowing what he doesn't know, and I don't mean that to sound airheaded either. But something that needs to be considered that some of the heat advocates are missing is You need the heat recyclers to consume at least some measure of heat from a gameplay perspective, otherwise you're still introducing an exploit, only a different kind. In this instance, the exploit would be unlimited free energy so long as the grid has heat. And assuming you've got sufficient cooling and heat cyclers are present, you can run into the issue where heat recyclers and a couple of batteries are all that's needed to run a grid. Batteries to get it started, heat recyclers to keep everything else rolling. And if you have sufficient cooling to keep it all from overheating, you're not going to have need for reactors, turbines, solar, other sources of power, so on. So just to quantify something for discussion, the heat recyclers don't have to consume the greatest amount of stuff. Let's say that radiators get rid of 100 heat units a second, and thermal batteries get rid of 40, and a heat recycler gets rid of 15. This way, it's still low enough that you're going to need multiple heat recyclers to equal even just one radiator, and it's not going to replace them completely. But you also don't have the infinite free power in this instance. Now, in real life, geothermal energy uses the energy of heat that gets converted into other sources that we can actually use. Now, conservation of mass and energy states that matter and energy can't be created or destroyed, only changed from one form to another, meaning that the total amount stays the same in a constant closed system. Now, heat recyclers would basically be a type of geothermal power source, and not allowing the recyclers to at least change some of that heat energy into electrical energy and convert it over like that and consume it would violate the conservation of mass and energy and break realism, which was stated as a goal of the heat system beforehand. And, heat recyclers don't need to consume super high amounts of heat again, but they need to consume enough of it that you don't have infinite free energy that replaces all other power sources. Otherwise, instead of infinite cooling, you have infinite free energy, which I would argue infinite free energy is even worse than infinite free cooling. Because if you think a ship with 1 billion weapons and shields is bad already, wait until you see one that has infinite free energy on top of that. Then let me know if you still think that's bad. Now, although the heat recyclers would consume a very small amount of heat, you're still going to need multiple of them to equal a thermal battery or a radiator, let alone, other stuff. Now, I would assume that since they generate energy, there would be a point where if you have too many heat recyclers, their heat dissipation is going to break even. And if you go much further past that, you're actually going to cause the opposite to happen, where you're generating more heat because of the excess power being used. As such, there would be a limit to their effectiveness that allows them to be useful without completely replacing everything else. Think of it as like a diminishing return kind of thing if you've ever played World of Warcraft or similar, type of games where you hit a certain point and it's better to invest in other stuff. This is kind of what I'm envisioning here. So getting into some of his additional notes towards the end of the video, we're going to look at the good, the neutral, and some of the just downright bad. So first off is the good. You have the global heat toggle where people could turn it on or off, or they could dial the heat generation up or down depending, and also the ability to jettison heat sinks that have been superheated to perhaps send a false heat signal so people could escape or so forth. So a heat system that could be toggled on or off for me is a must before we even start talking, and I'm glad to see Diggrok mention that here. That way nobody is forced to play with something they just absolutely hate. Like the idea of having the slider, because let's say this was implemented. It could be a case of that on, say, the normal or fast, I don't really care for it, but on the slower setting, it's not that bad, and I actually end up liking it. That could end up happening. Now, the jettison heat sink thing, that also makes a very big assumption in that you're going to have heat detecting sensors to start with. Now, it's cool because jettisoning that heat sink could be like firing a flare and is a nice way to mirror flares fooling heat-seeking missiles in real life, so I like that part of this. He also mentions another thing that could potentially happen as he's mentioned boosting above top speed temporarily, like a quick, break the speed limit kind of thing, like giving a shot of nitrous to your car. However, limiting the temporary top speed boost that he talks about can be done without the need for heat, and it can be accomplished by exactly that, a nitrous type of thing. Have the nitrous be like a special blend of fuel that is dedicated purely to the speed boost. And the nitrous, quote unquote, would need to be replenished before you can use the boost again. And this is just one example of how you can keep it from being overpowered. Is kind of think of it like a boost meter in something like Star Fox if you've ever played that. Now, getting into some of the neutral stuff is we have potentially hinged deflectors being attached to radiators to offer them a little more protection, and we have some of the stuff with the underground base. Is they would have to remove their heat to the surface. They could have a surface cooling station that it transports the heat to the heat sinks. But he also talks about it giving better protection from enemies just trying to drill in or bore into somebody's base. And you can see some of it here. So, a few things that I take issue with here, and that I see that pushes this into the neutral section versus being considered a good thing, is the armored radiators don't need to be a thing when their purpose can be accomplished just as easily through adding armor around the blocks in the first place, and let it be closed up via something like, hangar doors or hidden behind blast doors, mounted to pistons, similar to what we can already do now. Especially if the armored variants are going to eat a potentially massive penalty when you close them up. At that point, again, I would rather just have dedicated armor blocks that are even stronger than the plated radiators, because if I'm going to eat a penalty anyway, I might as well make the most of it. And this is an instance where me as a content creator, I would say that less is more. When it comes to the underground bases, I put this section, or put them into the neutral section, because, again, I don't think that this part has been thought through as well as people believe it has. And here's why. So the heat feature is being touted as giving additional protection to underground bases, since somebody couldn't just drill infinitely and bore straight into a base. Now, while, yes, that is going to provide some limited protection in this area, it's ignoring that that with sufficient cooling, somebody could achieve a heat neutral or a heat negative setup even with a mining rig, making it impossible to overheat it, thus bypassing the protection that the heat function claims to offer. Now, you're never going to be able to 100% hide or protect an underground base. That's just not going to happen. However, if the goal is to give them additional protection, another issue that I have is forcing them to pipe their heat to the surface exclusively just puts a big fat target on the base that says, "I'm over here, come shoot me." And it defeats the purpose of having the underground base to start with from a gameplay standpoint. They don't have to nuke your base at that juncture to make it useless. They just have to nuke your surface cooling, and then you're screwed. In addition to this, forcing the cooling to the surface ignores that you can disperse heat into underground areas in real life, even now, without having to, be at the surface. An example of this is I almost said Minecraft, but Microsoft, there we go, Microsoft, sinking a computer server under the ocean to keep it cool. The excess heat is pulled away by the much cooler water because, as we know, heat rises, that sort of thing. Likewise, the excess heat could be pulled away in part via some of the much cooler minerals or some of the much cooler air underground. While not as great as being submerged in water, one can't completely ignore the effect of perhaps dispersing some of that hot air into the much cooler, underground caves or wherever your base happens to be. Not to mention the base could just have a bunch of vents, pushing that super hot air up, a ventilation tunnel, if you want to call it that, that's aimed at the surface, so it doesn't actually have to have its cooling on the surface. At best, the new downsides to underground bases will cancel out the new benefit, leading to a neutral outcome. Hence why I put it in this section versus it being purely negative, but it could still go into the negative category. Now, this is where I have my biggest issues, and where I've got to call a bit of shenanigans on certain stuff. So, the heat function is touted as being a counter by some people to gun bricks, quote-unquote, and internal welders and so on and so forth, which could also be, said to counter internal thrusters and so forth, countering internal welders that allow you to repair infinitely with no cost, and stopping gun bricks with a bunch of turrets that are just bolted on with no preparation or skill and making it arcadey. So, this is where the Heat advocates lose me, and they're going to lose a lot more people with statements like this, is because when you start focusing on this kind of thing, as I mentioned previously, it ceases to be about the new challenges that they say they want, and it becomes a weapon to shut down builds that they don't like. It attempts to punish people for wrong think, or wrong build, or building incorrectly in this instance, whether it's through the ignorance of just not thinking through the full extent of the Heat system, or whether it's deliberate malice. It's overall a solution in search of a non-existent problem that tries to force said solution on the community as a whole, when individual server limits can achieve the desired results of limiting gun bricks, internal welders, internal thrusters, and so forth. And we can already limit these things right now in Space Engineers 1 via server settings. They were actually released not too long ago at the time of filming this. I think not actually in the core update that they just put out like a week prior to filming this, but like 1 or 2 updates before that, where server owners can go in and they can put something in their settings that says, a grid can't have more than, say, 10 Gatling turrets, or more than 10 welders as a possibility. Thus, if somebody's playing on server A and they want those limitations, they can get it. Whereas, say, if I'm over on server B, I can play without those limitations if I want to. Both sides win, both sides get what they want, and if that's not enough for some of the people on server A, they can agree to further limitations if desired via gentleman's agreement or so forth. Now, when I see stuff like the above come into play, something else, too, is it tells me people are way too worried about what everyone else is doing. And respectfully, some people need to stay in their own lane when it comes to that. So long as somebody has put in the proper engineering without exploits to make that gun brick work with, say, 50 plus turrets without blowing themselves up, and they're able to get wins as a result, I don't see anything wrong with this. I really don't. The same goes for internal welder or internal thruster setups. If people don't like it, don't build that way. Or play with people that do. Use server settings to limit it if you think you have to. But like it or not, gun bricks, internal welders, and thrusters are just as valid of build styles as the more proper quote-unquote builds. And if somebody is constantly losing to gun bricks, internal welders, and thrusters, and stuff like that, that tells me one of a few things, perhaps several, is going on here. Either your build and piloting isn't as good as you think it is, their build and piloting is just better than yours, your tactics need to change, or perhaps all of it. And as Captain Picard once told to Data, it's still possible to do everything right and still lose. It's just a part of life. Now, if someone is constantly losing to one particular build or setup and no exploits have been involved in that build, instead of getting mad and demanding the game as a whole change, people should be figuring out how that build ticks and then how to counter it. Now here is my Endokan Dreadnought carrier. Well, an older version of it from before Warfare 2. Now, if I had to do this over today, and I had some of what we had today, the ship would be a lot different. It would still employ similar firepower and the welder repair system that it has baked in. But I do have to ask the question, though, because there's no, universal definition of a gun brick. So if I was to take some of those more clustered turrets and distribute them more evenly around the ship, would it still be a gun brick? Or would it be considered magically okay now? That's one of my issues with that. So, again, what is a gun brick? Because what I consider a normal amount of weapons in a medium-sized ship, another person might not. And, they may consider, what I consider a medium-sized ship with decent weapons, they may consider a gun brick dreadnought type of thing. Now the Indokan, as shown in this picture here, even though the picture's old as dirt, is inspired in part by the Kessock from Star Trek Bridge Commander, who had automatic repair systems to handle things so the crew could focus on other tasks, and they also preferred to point their top shields at the target and attack from below a target, or, above it, however you want to say, with the top of their ship pointed down. And that's just how they did it, to take advantage of being in a 3D space. And one of the problems with Space Engineers combat is far too many people tend to think of it as a 2D plane, and it's really not. The Indokan's setup is meant to take advantage of that 3D plane by getting under the target and then firing upwards versus, other stuff. Now, in addition to the logic of the gun brick people, by some of the logic they're using here, the old St. Louis class cruisers and the real-life dreadnought battleships that were created around the turn of the 1900s would be considered gun bricks, even though there's real-life reasons for those being the way that they are. Now, internal welder repair systems, at least for this particular ship, are used to keep some of the weapons and thrusters online during combat without me having to leave the cockpit to take care of it all the time. And this is because most of the time I'm either playing solo or with a small handful of people, which is usually less than 10. And since I don't often have a crew to keep a ship rolling in combat, I have to find other ways to stay alive. Yet according to the Heat feature logic, I'm wrong for wanting to have these welder repair systems like this, and basically being told I should have to fight at a disadvantage because others don't like it. And I should essentially have to fight, doing everything myself versus being able to automate some stuff. Now, contrary to what people think, and this is one area that I am going to call shenanigans on one thing that Diggrok said. Now, again, I don't think he meant it maliciously, but he still said it nonetheless. So, if he does see this, I mean this with the utmost respect, my dude, but you're definitely wrong to say that internal welders give infinite repairs at no cost. That's just not how that works at all. In order for the internal welders to do their thing for, say, a ship like mine, I have to first place them all around the ship, and I have to keep a massive stockpile of components on board the ship itself for the welders to actually pull from and repair with, which is going to weigh the ship down a heck of a lot more than it would be otherwise. And once the back stock of components has been depleted, the internal welders are basically just dead weight, which at best are going to keep the armor from being deformed. And that's all it's going to be. The only time welders can ever repair infinitely without any drawbacks is if somebody is in creative mode. And if somebody's in creative mode doing all their fighting, that's a them problem. That's not a me problem. Even then, you can still overwhelm the welders, and if you get enough of a burst of damage on a particular spot, you're going to break that armor because that welder's not going to be able to keep up. There's only so much they can do at once, and even then there's a delay in the damage versus them actually doing the repair. Now, for me at least, the internal welders allow me to keep some semblance of functional repairs without a massive crew. And if the shields were a thing, then I might not use as many of them. I ain't going to lie about that. But until that comes, I'm going to use what I have available to me, just as I would expect anybody else to do. Now, by the logic of the Heat advocates, they are essentially assuming that my fun is wrong, purely because they don't like it, even though it's a part of the game. And I can't get behind that part of it. Now, I despise mill decks in Magic the Gathering and in Yu-Gi-Oh! And stuff like that. I've played them, I've played against them, and to me, it's just, they take no skill to play, and they're no fun to play against. Because they prevent people from playing their decks, and yeah, I joked about wanting to remove mill from the game, that kind of stuff. But my solution is to just not play with mill players, or to put some counters in my deck that, sticks it to the mill players. My dislike of mill being a mechanic doesn't just invalidate the strategy on its own. Same is true with gun bricks and internal welders and space engineers. Which, something else that I find funny is that people talk about internal welders and gun bricks, it's similar, but I've yet to hear a peep out of some people and some of the Heat advocates about stopping the use of gravity drives or clang drives or similar, which are actual exploits, mind you, because they're bypassing the need for thrusters and engines outright, which was never intended by Keen at all. And even though I despise grav drives and similar, I do believe that folks should be able to do that on their own servers if that's what they want to do, like super gridding beforehand, where you could get large grid stuff on small grid builds if you did super gridding. But anyway, that's my thought on that. So, getting into some of what the Heat advocates need to be focusing on and trying to answer is, when designing content for a game, you have to answer several questions, and this is in no particular order. First up is, why would I ever want to go to this map, use this item, or in this case, use the Heat system? You've got to answer, what are the potential downsides of this? What are the potential upsides to this? What purpose does the item, map, or system serve? And what form or forms, if applicable, is it going to take? And they don't give adequate answers to all of this. But first up, some obligatory statements. Is something that I learned early on in developing content is it doesn't matter how good I think I did, it matters how good the players of said content think that I did. I can think I made the best thing ever, and can defend that position and cater to a smaller audience if I choose. However, if I want the most people to play it as possible, I need to consider what those people like and what they want. Now, the players are almost always going to take the path of least resistance with the most rewards. By and large, that's just how people are in game and in real life. Like in real life, why would I increase my workload several times over at a job for no extra pay when I don't have to? Same is true for space engineers in any other game. If I have three paths in front of me, A, B, and C, A being the least rewarding and the easiest, B being the medium level hard but giving good rewards, or C being twice as hard as B with no extra reward, why would I ever take C when I can take B and be done a lot quicker for the same reward? Why would I ever do that? Now, whether it's AAA studio devs, indie devs, or modders, you can't make people play in a way that they don't want to play, because people will either find ways around what you're trying to do or just straight up not play your content if they think you're trying to pigeonhole them too much. And when making one of my first maps for Time Splitters, I had longer hallways on part of it that I envisioned people would do most of their heavy fighting in. However, in reality, they ended up fighting on a completely different part of the map, more often than not. And I did a similar map later on where I actually tried to force them into the hallways, and that map flopped so hard, and was actually one of my least downloaded maps ever. Now, another thing too that I learned is, if you want players to do something in-game, you have to give them reasons to want to do it your way. Such as the first question up there. Why would I want to go to this map? Why would I want to use this item? Why would I want to use this system? What purpose is it? What are the positives? Trying to pull the do it my way or else card is just going to make them not want to play your content, and potentially telling you to do anatomically impossible things. Now, per the previous example, if I wanted people to take path C, which is the hardest path, the best way of getting them to do that is to stick some of the best, if not the best, rewards on that path. And the best way to get players to do something is maybe to nudge them in a direction a little bit, but make them think it was their own idea to go that way and not yours as the developer. So, yeah, there could be a little bit of, maybe some reverse psychology there at some point, or however you want to say it, but that's the most effective way. Now, I say all of that to get to this. If I, as the creator of a level, map, item system, or whatever, want players to use my map, my item, play with it, or so forth, I have to be able to answer all five of these particular questions myself. If I can't give adequate enough answers to this first one especially, of why they would ever want to use it, then how could I expect the players to have answers themselves? Because if I'm the creator of it and I can't answer that question, how can I expect the players to have an answer? It does a disservice to me and them both at that juncture. Continuing along with these questions, when people are asked to invest their money into something, they're going to expect an equal or greater value in return for what they're investing. Same goes for time, effort, and so forth. As mentioned earlier in the video, I value build freedom that we've had in SE1 for over a decade now. If I want to make the most ridiculous gun brick known to man, I can do it. If I want to do a 1-to-1 scale Enterprise D from Star Trek, I can do it. If I want to do a tiny little A-Wing from Star Wars, I can do it. If I'm going to be asked to give up some of that build freedom, then I'm going to expect an equal or greater value back from the Heat system compared to the build freedom that I gave up. Now, Heat advocates have done a good job of answering a couple of these questions. They've done a good job of answering number 2, what's some of the negatives or potential challenges? They've answered, what is the purpose of it? What's the form that it's going to take? But they've not really given much answers to the positive side of things. What makes people want to use it? And why people should want to have it? And that's, like I said, kind of like going to a car dealership and telling them you need a car that meets at least 2.5 of the criteria of X, Y, and Z, but there's not enough talk of how they do that. Now, in order to use this system, in order to use the Heat system, I would be asked to give up my ability to make gun bricks, internal welders, the ability to drill continuously until I run out of fuel or energy, or max out my inventory space, depending on which drill method I'm using. I would be asked to give up some of the stealth of an underground base, my ability to conceal certain critical components in the hull, and a host of similar things while managing a new stat. I would be asked to give up my ability to make things like the Enterprise D, an Earth Space Dock style space station, my ability to use internal welders to decently keep up with repair crews, or with repairs due to a lack of consistent crew, and build larger scale items, and some similar things for what exactly? Like, what's the positives to it? Because the only positives I see from this new system so far are some new detection methods, which are heat-based, that may or may not even work at all if somebody's able to conceal their heat signature, as well as turbine power, which I can really only use on planets, even though we already have windmills and stuff. Then there's the heat recyclers, which may or may not provide much power or any heat reduction. And then potentially bits of slowing down hydromanning, and that's pretty much it. So basically, a few new sensors, a couple of token power sources that I'm probably not going to use too often. So that's not enough value for me currently to want to make that trade. So the question of positives and number 1 of why would I want to use this isn't being adequately answered. Now, really quickly to touch on hydromanning, because yes, this is a concern. Now, in order to stop hydromanning, which for people that aren't familiar with the term, it's basically like you get some guy that he runs around with hand tools and he tries to saw your grid in half or do whatever just to be a jerk, or however. Yes, this could potentially slow that down. But if you want to stop hydromanning, you have to examine why people do it. You don't cure a disease by just managing the symptoms. You treat the root cause of it, and then the symptoms manage themselves. In Space Engineers 1, Keen made it so that if you die and you don't respawn in a med bay or survival kit, you spawn with 20% of all of your stats, like your health, your hydrogen, your energy, and so forth, meaning you can't run, you're likely to run out of power before you get much of anything done, and you're much more likely to die if you try to go back to where you were before. And these penalties can be tightened or loosened by server owners and so forth, or even disabled completely. Now, to further combat hydromanning, you could even add a small respawn timer to med bays or survival kits if people are dying so many times in a short period. World of Warcraft does this, starting off at, say, like a 10-second interval, and then scales all the way up to as high as 2 minutes before you can res again if you get back to your corpse in a short period of time. You can also run to a spirit healer elsewhere in the world, and they'll revive you, but you're going to take res sickness for a time. And the reduced stats is basically Keen's version of res sickness, and spawn timers like this could be set by the server owners. If all else fails at keeping hydromanners at bay and keeping them from being jerks, you can always just ban them from the server or just not play on servers that see no issue with this kind of thing. Now, Heat may slow this sort of behavior down, but it's only managing the symptom. It's not treating the disease. And I personally fail to see why a game-wide mechanic like Heat needs to be potentially forced on everyone when there's much better ways of controlling hydromanning behavior that can be dealt with at the individual level. But getting back to the final part of what Heat advocates should be focusing on more is, one of the big questions I would ask is, why would I want to tie turbines to Heat when we're likely to get turbine-style power without tying it to Heat anyways? You can see all the promotional stuff for them building dams and having the liquid water and that kind of stuff. And it's been strongly implied through various promos and comments that we're probably going to get hydroelectric power as a thing anyway. So if I know I'm automatically going to get this anyways, then that takes away from question number 3 of positives that I could get. And it also takes away from question number 1 of why would I want to use this and what are some of the positives? Because that can't be tied strictly to Heat now. In addition to this, why would I want to tie the new detection methods to Heat and have a sensor that may or may not detect a ship at all if they can just hide their Heat signature and effectively stay cloaked the whole time, when I could just jack up the range on a regular sensor now and guarantee I'm going to see the enemy coming without all the downsides? Which is actually something I did with my sensor array anyway, that I have for Space Engineers 1. Overall, I'm being asked to give up a lot of build freedom for very little in return. And I don't see it. I don't see the value. Like being asked to give up $500 in investment for $100 in return. Why would I do that? Right now, the Heat advocates need to focus more on the positives that the Heat system can bring, and they've already got a good start on everything else. They've got a good start on, what form is it going to take? What could it potentially serve? And what are some of the challenges or negatives that could come with it? They've not done enough explaining question 1 or question 3 here, and that's what's really hurting them right now. Now, currently there needs to be more return on investment to make people want to use the system. For some people, you may never get there. You may never convince them to like Heat. Just like I'm never going to convince everybody to like shields and want to try it. I'm somebody that likes that, but I'm never going to convince everybody to like it. Hence the reason for the switch. However, if people focus more on the positives, then they may actually win some people over. But currently, all the major complaints I'm seeing of Heat can be addressed already by existing systems given to server admins and SE1. Hey folks, post-production Captain Blade here, and I wanted to take a moment to add this on for you folks. I know that we're running fairly long as it is, but whenever I was reviewing everything in post, I realized that I should have elaborated a bit, or at least a bit more, on some of the positives that I would like to see myself if and when a Heat system were to ever come to the game. Now, this is by no means a complete or exhaustive list of things that could be done. However, it could add some extra value that's currently lacking in the why would I ever want to use this, and what are some of the positive departments. Now, in addition, this could also open the doors for a couple of fun things that people have joked about over the years in Space Engineers. Now, some of it would be a little bit harder to implement than other things, but I like to think it could be done fairly simply enough in the grand scheme of things, while also avoiding some of the pitfalls of the heat system as previously proposed. Now, I will say for me, simply adding a heat system purely to balance combat or purely to balance survival still comes off as too much of a weaponization against wrong build or building incorrectly or even wrong think in the game. But to me, if the heat advocates were willing to consider some of these things, then I think this could potentially bridge the gap with some people that are hesitant, perhaps even get their support on board, myself included. But let's go ahead and dive into this. So, one of the first examples that I'm going to give here is increased efficiency if there is sufficient cooling present on a block. So, the example that I used here is a reactor. And let's assume that a reactor operates at the standard normal efficiency when there is no heat units present. And let's also, just for sake of discussion to quantify something, let's assume that it operates at 50% efficiency if there are 50 heat units present due to overheat. On the opposite side of the coin, the reactor could potentially operate at, say, 110% efficiency if the block moves to, say, minus 10 heat units, meaning it's gone potentially into a negative category. Now, some examples of how this could work with some other blocks is, let's say, weapons could maybe get a couple of additional shots off before they get too hot. This assumes that there's enough sufficient cooling to start with. An example for gas tanks could be that they drain, say, 5% slower due to fuel being more condensed. And maybe they could store an additional 5% gas if they're sufficiently cooled. If they get too warm, they would lose the benefits, and they can't regain those benefits unless they're cooled again. And if the gas tank gets too warm, while it has that extra 5% gas in there, instead of having it just straight up rupture the tank, it could trigger a pressure release valve to vent the extra 5% gas, similar to some of the propane gas tanks or even some of the water heaters and similar stuff that we have in use today. Another example could be refineries and crafting blocks could craft slightly faster, again, say 5%. Now, this 5% or the extra 10% efficiency for the reactor doesn't have to be the final number. Again, this is purely to quantify something for sake of discussion. But I would imagine some of this could perhaps be done more so for gameplay reasons and not purely strictly for realism. Because I would imagine some of this isn't going to be super hyper realistic, but this would be one of those instances where I would say that realism takes a slight step backwards in favor of adding some additional fun and some reasons for people to want to engage with the system, which are currently lacking. Another example of a block that could potentially be used, and this is where we get into opening up the door for some other stuff that people have joked about over the years, is a heat condenser type of block to weaponize heat. You know, it could be a block that's akin to a custom air vent type that, quote-unquote, vents the heat so far in front of it in a specific direction, and it can superheat an area to get rid of intruders. Kind of like locking them in a room and, you know, cooking a bug or something like that. Or if you were one of those kids that had a magnifying glass that cooked ants or something like that. Very crude examples, but you kind of get the idea. Another thing is if the air vent idea seems too bland, then perhaps consider making a heat turret of some kind, like a pseudo flamethrower, or perhaps just go for it and make an actual flamethrower at this point. You know, we've joked about this kind of stuff over the years in the space engineers community, but this is a way to open the door for some of that stuff and make it legitimate. Some other examples could be if exposing certain plants to the vacuum of space, like in Space Engineers 1, kills them, perhaps you could have heat give a slight bit of growth acceleration to certain plants on the opposite side of the coin. For people like Diggrok and some guys like that that enjoy, some of the more visual aspects of heat and so forth, you could have the burnt crispy skin visuals for certain stuff, or that smoky look. You could also, on the opposite end of that coin, have more chilled or cool visuals for certain stuff. We already have some of that now in Space Engineers 1, but this would just add to it a little more. And then finally, some of the other things is a lack of heat could be used to preserve certain food items, and the addition of heat can be used to cook or destroy certain items. So this opens up the door for if you wanted the potential for food to spoil or go bad, you have a way to refrigerate and preserve it, as well as another means of immersion for the cooking aspect of things. Perhaps certain foods cook a little better at certain temperatures than others. And then finally, this is a big one sitting at the bottom here, is thermal vision for engineer suits. And that would be just like it sounds. If you've played any kind of secret agent game, something like one of my personal all-time favorites is the Rainbow Six Vegas and Rainbow Six Vegas 2, where you have the night vision goggles, but you can also pop down the heat vision goggles to see perhaps a little bit better and pick up different heat signatures. This could potentially open the door to that depending on how advanced they wanted to go with it. But anyways, I wanted to go ahead and mention this for you guys. But we're going to get to the final thoughts of the video and then go ahead and close it out. But like my past self is going to say, let me know what you guys think about this. And I'll see you guys at the end of the video. Getting into my final thoughts now. As I said earlier in the video, although heat is a realistic thing and would certainly give new stuff to do in Space Engineers, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing automatically, and games also don't need to be 100% realistic to be fun, and there are absolutely times that realism needs to take a back seat to fun. The entire point of the games is to have fun, and if you're not having fun and it's just a chore, why are you still playing at that point? And currently, all of the chief complaints of Heat advocates can be addressed with existing systems server-side and some cosmetic blocks. Now, I don't fault them for liking what they like and proposing what they do. They're allowed to like what they like and even dislike what they dislike, just as I do. However, if the goal is balance and better combat, there's far better ways to make things last longer than a few seconds and give people early warnings than what they're wanting to do here. And I'm going to cover this in some more detail when I get to the next video on combat and shields. However, very briefly, I'm going to touch base on how I solved some of those issues by doing a couple of things myself. I made some stronger armors and some stronger cockpits and balanced them at the singular block versus singular block, performance level. I created my Duramax armor and some Duramax reinforced items. Now, the Duramax armor comes in 3 variants, light, medium, and original heavy. They're 6 times stronger than vanilla light armor, 6 times stronger than vanilla heavy, and 10 times stronger than vanilla heavy with a slightly higher weight, respectively. Now, assuming large grid in Space Engineers 1 for a moment, it takes 8 shots from a vanilla railgun to break 1 block of the Duramax heavy. And that's like one of the armor cubes. Now, that may seem like a lot to people, but this is assuming that only a single large vanilla railgun is firing. If there is a vanilla railgun plus a Gatling and an assault cannon peppering that block too, it's going to go down a lot faster, because every weapon you're adding is going to grow the damage exponentially compared to just the basic stuff. Now, the armor is certainly durable and it can be breached, and it's definitely not invincible, especially if you're using the rebalanced weapons that I made with it also. But what I did was I set an initial balance of what I wanted 1 block of armor to be able to take from 1 weapon, such as 1 cube versus 1 railgun, 1 cube versus 1 Gatling, and so on and so forth, and adjusted the numbers accordingly if I felt a weapon was too weak or too strong after testing. After that, it's an arms race among the end users. If they want to breach it more quickly, then they bring more than one gun. If they want to survive longer, they can add extra armor or better piloting, stick a welder back there, however they need to do it. More guns means more damage going out and the armor gets breached faster. At that point, it's a chess match of who can bring more of what and use said what better than the other person. Because of this, I can now take fighters against large grid ships. After my rebalance, I can take them against vanilla stuff and still have them be useful. Now, the larger ships are always going to have an advantage just because of what they are and the other stuff they can bring to the table, but they're not unkillable, which is the point. And fighters, with the way I did it at least, last a good fair bit longer. The problem with vanilla Space Engineers 1, and potentially SE2 to an extent, as much as I love Keen and enjoy Space Engineers, their point of balancing leaves much to be desired at times. And the vanilla light armor and even the vanilla heavy armor sometimes is basically tissue paper, with the small grid light armor basically being a suggestion and not necessarily, being actually really a thing. But overall, I don't yet see enough value in a heat system to warrant my using it or throwing my support behind it. It requires too much investment for too little in return, and its stated goals can also be achieved via server admin settings that we have available now without all the need for extra downsides. The new detection and power sources also do not need to be tied to heat when we can get just as good, if not better, with other means. And I'm not trying to fault the heat advocates for liking what they like, because again, they're allowed to like what they like. But looking at this from, I'll admit, somewhat of a biased perspective, but also trying to be objective, the system needs more thought put into it than what's actually here. What Diggrok has proposed is a very, very great start, and I will give him that. But at the same time, there needs to be more thought put into the positives. And I do believe that Diggrok wants to do right by the community. Now, with some quantifications of existing vagueness, some more additions to the positive side of things, the system could be valuable. And I wouldn't say it's useless as it is right now, but it's definitely incomplete. So, anyway, that's some of my thoughts on things. You folks let me know. What do you think about things? Is there something that perhaps, you think I missed? Is there something you think he could have missed? Is there something that both of us missed? Let me know what you guys think. Is heat something you would want to see? Is there a different form of it you would want to see? You let me know what you guys think. But anyway, folks, this is my thoughts on everything. I wanted to try to get this out there to show some of the opposite side of things. This ran a lot longer than I would have intended to originally. But, Diggrok, he gave us almost basically a 4-course meal. And quite a lot to chew on. But for now, folks, let me know what you guys think. This is Captain Blade, J52, signing off.